Hello, BookTube. It's Friday, and that means Friday Reads here on BookTube when we stop our busy lives, talk a little about the things we've recently read, things we've recently reread, things we're currently reading, things that are on the docket for immediate reading in the future. I have had an uneven relationship with Friday Reads on this channel over the years, but I want to do one today, give you sort of along those same lines, stuff that I've recently read or reread, stuff that I am currently reading, and stuff that I will be reading in the future. Rundown that I'm hoping won't take 5 hours to do. I won't include everything. I'll just include the stuff that's worth talking about here, and I've got the iPad and I've got props like a regular booktuber. So we'll start with this. This was a reread. I got the finished copy and reread Alfie and Me by Carl Safina. This is, on the surface, a book about Safina and his wife taking in an owl, a screech owl. It's a popular kind of subgenre in nature. There are many I took in an owl books. I'm a big fan of most of them. Most of them I think are wonderful. Something about that pairing seems to work really well. But this transforms into more than that. It becomes more than just, look at the quirks of this owl. It becomes, a meditation on on the wild world, yes, but also in a weird way, this is one of the most effective COVID books that I've ever read. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. This author's credit in the Bank of Steve could not be any higher. He would have to be a drastic departure from his writing habits to lose that credit. He would basically have to write a Trump book. And I don't see him doing that. This was terrific. Absolutely terrific. Okay, then we have a headline-grabbing celebrity memoir that I read knowing that I'm not the target audience, knowing all of that. This is The Woman in Me by Britney Spears, the 90s pop star Britney Spears, who has had a fairly torturous life. That the ups and especially the downs of her life are pretty clear in this book. This would have been prime fodder for CPL Radio's Book of the Day with my producer Jeff. If we still did that show, this would have been prime fodder for 25 minutes of cracking jokes. This is essentially a sad story. There's far more sadness in this book than happiness, even though this is a person who has experienced the rapturous cheers of sold-out coliseums, which neither you nor I have ever experienced or ever will experience. There won't be any surprises here because all of this person's life has been lived in public. So if you're at all interested in her, you already know all the details in this book. The thing that bothered me about it is not the book's fault. It's a tacit understanding between the book and the audience that I know perfectly well. I know perfectly well that Britney Spears was not involved in the writing of this book. Britney Spears is a very talented singer and performer. The impression I got by the end of this book is that she is a very brave young woman. But we're all friends here. She's an imbecile. She has the mental capacity of a yearling calf in a farm. So there's that dichotomy, that weird dichotomy that runs throughout the reading of this book. I am reading an autobiography that is not written by the name on the cover. It could not have been written by the name on the cover. It couldn't be read by the person on the cover. That's a weird thing. It's a really weird thing. Imagine if there were an 800-page biography of a 2-year-old baby in a bookstore. Here's my story. You'd pick it up and you'd read it, and depending on the skill of the writer involved, I don't know who the writer involved here was, but they're very skillful, you would be caught on with the story, you'd be turning the pages, but the whole time there would be that weird dichotomy, that fissure in your brain, because the baby didn't write the book. So, I know this is old hat. Celebrity memoirs almost always engender this kind of reaction in me. Every once in a blue moon, I will read a celebrity memoir and put it down and think, I almost think that was written by the celebrity, but that almost never happens. Certainly didn't happen here. Very interesting subject, but weird, unsettling. Then a reread. I'm going to try to put a few rereads in here. This is Diamonds Are Forever, Ian Fleming. This is a James Bond novel. I recently reread Dr. No, and I will reread Dr. No again closer to November. And I recently reread Octopussy, and I didn't like either one of them. and it's not just a question of not liking James Bond, although, boy, oh boy, is James Bond a dislikable character. I'm not talking about the bad guys dislike him. I'm saying any normal person would dislike him. He is a weird choice to become an icon of masculinity, maybe in the movies. But in the books, he is just a fussy little a-hole. You just want to punch him in the face. You want the villains to succeed in their Baroque attempts to kill him. The books have a lot more tedious, fussy little details than you remember, especially if you mostly know this character from the movies. When I was rereading Diamonds Are Forever, I was thinking, this guy he's more fussy and more in the old school definition of effeminate than Hercule Poirot. Why are we thinking of Poirot as this fussy little Belgian man when Bond is much worse? He's much worse than that. But also the story's inept. The storytelling is inept. The writing is mostly inept. This is 3 Bond novels in a row. I'm doing these obviously as a lead up to Dr. November, an espionage and secret agent themed event that is making its debut in November. I'm one of the co-hosts, and I love this sort of stuff. So it's called Dr. November, so I knew I had to read Dr. No again, and I will read Dr. No one more time, closer to November. These things take an hour to read, so it's not that much of an endeavor. But despite the title of our event, I'm thinking Bond might not be for me. These are my first rereads in forever, and they are not going over well at all. Not at all. I don't know that they ever did go over well, but I think when I originally read these, probably there was the spell of glamour from the movies. The Bond franchise in the movie theaters, until it was ruined by Daniel Craig, was tremendously magical. Craig gave us a humorless Bond, which is not James Bond. That's like giving you a humorless Goofy. It just doesn't work at all. It could completely transforms the character. So I don't, okay, fine. They're humorless, glowering Tom Cruise action figure movies. They're not James Bond movies. There's no charisma. There's no humor. There's nothing like that. So needless to say, that of course applies to the final Daniel Craig Bond movie for obvious reasons that I won't spoil here. But maybe something of the glamour of that movie franchise was rubbing off on reading these books when I originally did. I don't know. I don't know what bloom has gone off the rose here, but I'm really thinking that for Dr. November, there are lots of other espionage authors to read, and a lot of them are intriguing anyway, even if they're not good. And like I mentioned in an earlier video, if intrigue isn't doing it, if your simple Cold War gimmick for your plot is not doing it for me, well, if I want genuine literary satisfaction, I know where to go, right? I can go to John le Carré. So I can do that. He's always there as a backstop. And our group read for Dr. November is The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. So it's not like I'm going rogue to pick on le Carré. I just like to stray away from him and see what else is out there. I don't know that it's going to be Bond, because Diamonds Are Forever was another failure of a Bond-related way for me. I don't know that how many of those I've got left in me. They don't take long to read, but still. Then this next one's a new piece of nonfiction. This is Werner Herzog. This is his book, Every Man for Himself and God Against All. This was hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. Probably one of the funniest books I will read this year. This, needless to say, this author, if he wrote this book, it was under the impression the whole time of something that is fundamentally not true. I lost track of how many times when I was paging through this thing that I said out loud, directors don't matter. I lost track of how many times I did that. If you did not know that directors don't matter, or even if you thought they did and maybe didn't know that this guy was, among other things, a director, you would assume in the reading of this book that you were reading a recently discovered memoir of Jesus Christ on earth. This is the memoir of someone who is completely convinced, down to his DNA, that his life is the most important life that has ever been lived. He's a director. He doesn't matter. He has a totally irrelevant profession. And since I think that way, I know a lot of you cinematistes don't, you film bros don't think that way, but since I do, This was hilarious. It's full of one bloody-eyed, grim, world-weary observation after another. Even the humor is done against the gallows of fate. When you're just some guy. Nobody knows who you are. The film bros know who you are, but you've never directed a Back to the Future movie. Anyway, I was obviously to talk about not being the target audience. I obviously wasn't the target audience for this thing, but I thought it was funny. I would not trade my reading experience with it at all. Then we have this thing. I've mentioned this before on this channel, The Exchange by John Grisham. I'll leave Bill Rutenberg to comment. He's the John Grisham expert here. I'll leave him to do the in-depth commentary on this when he gets around to it. But this is noteworthy. Grisham writes about a book and a half a year. I would say he writes half a book a year, but that would be churlish of me. The gimmick of this book is that it's his return to Mitch McDear, the main character in The Firm, the book that shot him to prominence and guaranteed that his book contracts would always be waiting for him, that he could write books for his whole life. I'm not 100% sure that Grisham is an author who has a lifetime of books inside him. I know that goes against the grain. The mirage here that the publishing world likes to encourage is that there are such things as natural storytellers, and if you're a natural storyteller, you have an endless supply of stories to tell. I don't believe that's true. I think that everybody has a book in them, a really good book in them. I think almost nobody has more than one book in them. The fact that Grisham wrote a really successful novel should not in any way be an indication that we should be listening to him, so-called listening to him, for the rest of his career, for 50 years. He doesn't have 50 years of stories in him. I don't know whether it's that he's bored or maybe disengaged. Maybe he likes model shipbuilding instead. Maybe he's developed other habits once you become a multimillionaire. But there's definitely no fire in the belly for his books anymore. And I was kind of thinking, well, if there's going to be fire in the belly for anything, it's going to be him returning to this character, the character that literally put him on the map, literally made him independently wealthy. And there isn't. That doesn't happen. I've made the observation that I made about the idea when this was floated was that the natural source of trouble for this book will be that Mitch McDear doesn't have a personality in The Firm. He doesn't have a personality. He's just tenacious. That's all. He learns that his law firm, Bendini, Locke, and Lambert, kills people. That they kill people, and they especially kill members of the firm who step out of line. And when he senses that the crosshairs might be on him, he fights back instead of curling up in a phone booth and taking 3 shots in the head. Well, okay, that doesn't exactly make you a Thomas Wolfe character, right? That just means you don't want to die. It's not really an exchange for a 3-dimensional personality. So my worry was, well, if you revisit this character, this book takes place years later, if you're under the impression that he had a character in The Firm, well, then you're going to be on wrong footing from page 1. And if you know that he didn't have one, you're going to have to invent one for him in this book, which annihilates its connection with The Firm. And I think it was the former. I think Grisham, I don't know this author at all, but I get the impression that he's under the impression that he created a character in The Firm. He didn't. You don't have to read the book to see that. He didn't. But nevertheless, I think he's under the impression that he did. As a result, there's no one to root for in this book, except John Grisham. And with John Grisham, you are hoping with this book, the thing you root for him to do is something interesting that will derive from the relationship between this book and The Firm. As far as I know, Grisham has never written a sequel before, except for his YA books. This is kind of a sequel, I think you could call it that. In other words, its success depends on its relationship with the earlier book. And I knew that going in, and I thought, okay, well, you probably know that too. You're not an author to my taste, but you are obviously an author to the taste of tens of millions of people, and you've been at this a long time. So you're going to know that you're going to have to connect this with The Firm. And as long as you don't do the simple, flat-footed, most obvious thing, you'll be fine. And he does that. He does the simple, most obvious, flat-footed thing. The simple, most obvious, flat-footed way to draw a connection between this book and the previous book would be for Mitch McDear to save the day in The Exchange by using nefarious methods that almost killed him when they were used against him in The Firm. A 5-year-old could think that up. And a 5-year-old would probably reject it and say, whatever I'm going to do, I'm not going to do that, because everybody in the world will be expecting that. So this was not satisfying. This is not satisfying at all. I'm now on a pretty bad run with Grisham in terms of things that are satisfying, in terms of these legacy authors who are satisfying. I'm thinking, if he ever satisfies me, he has occasionally done that. If he ever satisfies me again, it will either be when he does something extremely unexpected, something unusual, like playing for pizza, or if he gets a bad medical diagnosis and decides to write a memoir that is totally honest. One of those two things. But I don't know that his novels are going to satisfy me anymore. Then we have, this is by Taylor Birch. Pretty sure that's a pseudonym. This is an indie published book, and it's tentacle fiction. You didn't think I was going to do a Friday Reads without tentacle fiction, did you? This is his initiation. And it is stylized as MMM erotica. I know most of you know M/M erotica because that means male on male. Here's a third M. And there are tentacles. Plenty. Especially when the book reaches its climax. This is set in a world. The jokes just write themselves. This is set in a world that has only just recently discovered gay sex. So, 1950s Provincetown. It's not actually set in 1950s Provincetown, but I think you know what I mean. This world has only just recently discovered both, obviously, solo flex and cross-training, and also gay sex. And the guys go nuts. The guys go absolutely nuts in that world. And one of the ways that they go nuts, and one of the measures against going nuts, is to summon a tentacular monster. And the summoner must be initiated. And if you're familiar at all with tentacle fiction, the initiation is, well, I would say hands-on, but hands aren't involved. It's pretty messy. Anyway, this is delightful. Absolutely delightful. I loved it. Oh my God. All right, we're going straight from that to this next one. So somewhere someone is screaming. This is McKay Coppin's new book on Mitt Romney. This is made some press. Some talking head newscasters, the idiots that are serving for the mainstream media these days, got terrified flunkies to scan through this book. Stay up all night. I don't care. I make $6 million a year. You make nothing. You make $20,000 a year. But stay up all night and find I don't care what you have, what your personal life is. Your mother's got a leukemia appointment. I don't care. Skip it, or you're fired, and you'll never work again. I want you to stay up all night and find the one or two nuggets that we can use on air tomorrow. And I know that you've seen some of those nuggets here, but this is actually, there's a lot more to this than those nuggets. This author is really talented. I don't think I've ever encountered this author before. I'm sure I remember an author with a first name named McKay. This is well done. In terms of writing, this is well done. Of course, it's the revelatory shocker quotes that Romney says about, this person or that person that happens to be in the news right now that will make the news. But as a profile, this is pretty sharply written. The only problem with it is that it doesn't have a subject, which is a fairly big problem when you're writing a political profile. Romney has come to the forefront of certain areas of the mainstream news cycle because he seems almost like the last true Republican, the last one who's not a Trump cult member. He wanted to be part of Trump's administration. He wanted very much to be part of Trump's administration. Did a lot to mainstream Donald Trump until he turned left instead of right in the Capitol and thereby, by random chance, saved his own life from being torn apart, physically torn apart, by a mob that Trump had sent to the Capitol. After that, Romney seemed to have a moment of clarity, of calling out the insanely zealous religious Trump cult that his party has become. But that's not going to work for a whole book, especially with a main character who has not exhibited that moral clarity ever in a lifetime in politics. I know firsthand because despite the fact that Mitt Romney died in the wool Utah and is a Utah senator, he was governor of Massachusetts. He went shopping around for someplace where he could be governor so he could launch a presidential campaign. He was governor of Massachusetts. I got to know his habits rather intimately. I got to know him in the daily press rather well. And you only have a little, you only need a little of that familiarity to know that this person has no fixed principles, no deep thoughts, no beliefs, no strong beliefs, certainly not political beliefs. He's an empty set, and therefore McKay Coppin's talents are wasted, which is a shame. That is a real shame. I was reading. Actually, one of my strongest reactions when I was reading this thing was how I would love it if this guy would write a book like this about John Lewis, the late John Lewis. But instead, all this energy is wasted on Mitt Romney, who's a perfectly nice guy, but a weather vane. He's an empty suit. So that was also a little bit of a dissonant reading experience. Then we have urban fantasy. I've only dipped my toe in this. I haven't read the whole thing. This is by Andrew Givler, and it's called Soul Fraud. One of those really neat Michael McGrath type covers. It's urban fantasy about a lovable loser who can't get his life straight and seems to emit loser vibes to everyone around him, including a demon who thinks, well, if you're at such rock bottom, you won't mind selling me your soul for a guarantee of riches and success. And our main character, he might be a loser and he might be at rock bottom, but he's not willing to do that. So he refuses. And the demon forges his signature. So suddenly he doesn't have a soul anymore and wants to get it back. And that introduces him to a whole world of supernatural beings and supernatural rules and whatnot. I dipped my toe in. It's very energetic stuff. I think I'll read this tonight. Although I will have to fight against a strong objection, a principled objection to the very premise of this book. Anyone who has read supernatural fiction or seen cheesy supernatural TV shows and cheesy supernatural movies will know that the one thing the demon can't do is simply forge your signature. The signature needs to be real. Somehow it needs to be real through trickery, drugs, hypnosis, spells, whatever, but they can't simply forge your name. So, I don't know. I'm hoping there's a lot more nuance to that trick than the advanced notices of this book. The advanced notices on the book are quite funny. The author, Andrew Givler, I've never heard of him before. I don't know if this is his debut, but he gives the book a whole bunch of fake blurbs that are really funny. That are really quite funny. Friends of his, relatives of his, random girls from a bar saying, one of them saying, I didn't even know he could read. So, that sort of thing. He doesn't wait for critics. He just gives it fake blurbs on his own. That's kind of clever. And the bit that I read, the tiny bit that I read when I dipped my toe in, was very energetic. So it won't take long to read at all. I'm hoping that there's a loophole involved there, because that's not how selling your soul works. That's the one thing that the demon cannot do. Then this next one, I'll go back to celebrity memoirs. We started with celebrity memoirs. It wasn't meant to do this, but this is Worthy by Jada Pinkett Smith, who I think is the wife of Will Smith, the actor. I don't know much about her. I don't know much about her. I know a lot about Britney Spears because I was watching her career while it was unfolding and then deconstructing in real time. I don't know much about this woman. So all I had to go with was the conflicting impressions that I got in reading the book. Once again, I very much felt the guiding hand of someone who is not Jada Pinkett Smith. I very much felt the guiding hand of the person who actually wrote this book. I could practically break them down for you demographically. I got a very clear impression of who wrote this book by the end of it. It certainly wasn't Jada Pinkett Smith, and one of the reasons for that is not only because, I mean, if she's like I've said, if you have spent your life doing something else, it's very insulting to writers to just assume, much less ask other people to assume, that when you get a spare minute, you could write a book. It's not like that. Any of you who are trying NaNoWriMo will know it's not like that. Writing a book is a talent on its own. It's not something you keep in reserve while you do something else. So I think, completely justified to be completely skeptical that any celebrity ever wrote a book with their name on it. But here, in addition to the actual diction, the actual rhetoric of the book, giving me a clear impression of the middle-aged Jewish man who wrote this thing, I also got a clear impression of Jada Pinkett Smith, and she's nuts. I mean, she's not just stupid. She's the main character of this book is not just stupid, she's insane. I don't know anything about her. I don't think I've ever seen her. Is she an actress? Or have I only seen her in connection with her husband? one way or another, that could be interesting on its own, that the author is nuts, stupid and nuts, but only if the result was a scorched earth tell-all, and this is not that. This is not that. This is one sort of vapid self-affirmation after another. Just, I am ultimately the greatest person in the world. And that is very much like the Werner Herzog book, and the only way those two will ever be compared is that I am ultimately, when all is said and done, when the dust settles on all the stories that I'm telling you, the underlying message here is that I am the most important person who's ever lived. And considering that I don't know anything about this person, I'm guessing that's not true. Anyway, a little bit strange. A little bit, I never know where my reading's going to take me, though. This next one was a self-published book, or indie book, that was served up to me by one of those aggregator sites. I've praised them on this channel before. You can sign up for a whole bunch of them. Especially if you live in a book desert and you don't mind e-reading, which I bet is a lot of you. You don't have a good used bookstore near you and you don't mind e-reading. These services are great. One of you turned me on to them. There are a whole bunch of them out there. I'm sure I don't subscribe to all of them. Where you give them your email and they send you a daily blast of cheap ebooks, all across kinds of genres and whatnot, or free ebooks. I make a point not to buy anything, so I just go for the free ones. But even so, I've added like hundreds of free books to my Kindle just in the little time that I've had these aggregator sites. And I regularly go through them. I regularly try them and read them. You know, the first 2 or 3 chapters will be enough to know if the author is actually doing something on the page. And I read this by 2 authors, Sean Platt and someone working under the pseudonym of Johnny B. Truant. And this is called Dead City. And it's a zombie novel. It's not a hazardous waste novel, and it's also not a particularly urban novel either. It's a zombie novel, and it's really good. I really enjoyed it. It's the whole thing about zombie novels will be the world building, believe it or not, because the authors know perfectly well that we know this story. Every variation of it. We know this story has been done to death. So we know this story, every variation of it. So in order to make a zombie book interesting, you have to do it with conviction. And maybe a little bit of inventive moving around of the pieces. Like, for instance, in this book, and I guess it's a series, but I've only read this one book. In this book, Yellowstone National Park has been turned into a sort of a gated-off game preserve for people who have the virus that will eventually turn them into feral, face-eating zombies. So you can go to Yellowstone, and you can even go on a hunt of these things. But that's where a lot of them are penned in, as they have been removed from the cities that they initially took over. When no one knew what was going on, when they didn't understand the disease or its stages, these things took over cities, and those cities have been gradually cleaned out. I liked it. I liked it very much. A couple of the characters are well drawn. There's a lot of forward energy, and also there are some considerations that I don't always see in zombie fiction. In the setup here, the infected don't always go ravenously nuts. They often die in the long period, the month-long period where they know they're infected, but they haven't just gone wide-eyed and non-sentient yet. It was actually to give those people a very calm and beautiful natural setting for their final days of life that led to Yellowstone being selected as a segregation place for the living dead. I liked it. I would definitely go on to the second book, except the second book will probably cost me $1. And I'm not going to do that. Not at all. Then we have an old favorite. This was a reread, but I haven't read this in forever. This is David Wishart, who did a series of Roman historical mysteries, Roman murder mysteries set during the Flavians, during the Flavian period. So you've got Caligula, and then you've got Claudius. Tiberius in the really early stories. These star Marcus Corvinus, who is a wisecracking Sam Spade type figure. And the Sam Spade thing is openly anachronistic. You just have to get used to that. You have to. That's just a choice on the part of David Wishart. He's not writing this in ancient thee and thou type diction at all. So the attitude of Marcus Corvinus and a lot of the people around him is very 20th century. You just have to that's the decision of the author. You just have to be okay with that, and then they have to pull it off. And David Wishart really does. His books are really, really good, even when, as is the case with Going Back, not much happens. Some of his books are far more shot and incident than others. This one, Marcus Corvinus and his wife are tapped by Emperor Claudius to investigate the murder of a highborn nobleman, a Roman nobleman who has died in Carthage. It's not far from Rome, and of course, this is after the Punic Wars, so Carthage is a tourist destination, a relatively thriving little city, but certainly not the hub of a rival empire. And the dead man's relatives in Rome, Marcus Corvinus goes to interview them before they take ship for Africa, and they don't seem to care much about the dead man. They don't seem to know much about why he would be dead. What follows is there unfolds a very commonplace murder mystery. Wishart never really works very hard to hide whodunit. He does a little, but you'll easily be able to tell. And really, you just want it for the atmosphere. And I got plenty of that. This was very enjoyable to do. But you read a book like this in a series like this in order to see not so much Marcus Corvinus encounter first century Carthage as for David Wishart to describe it. And that worked. That worked really well for me. And of course, in all of the Corvinus books, you're always wondering if the murder mystery that he's embarked on will eventually be connected back to the Palatine in Rome. In the beginning of this book, when Claudius asks in heavy air quotes, because of course, as Corvinus points out, you don't say no to the emperor. When he asks Corvinus to look into this murder, it's described by Claudius and by the dead man's relatives as just, he was a Roman official. He's dead. We'd like someone to look into it, make sense out of it. Really, nothing more than that. So when you get a setup like that in a Corvinus novel, if you've read a few of them, you automatically wonder, okay, is that true? Is that as innocent as it seems? Or is this murder going to wind its way back to Claudius or someone in his immediate orbit? I don't want to spoil anything about the book in case you want to read it clean, because there are a couple of twists and turns at the end here. I enjoyed it, but then again, I don't think I've ever read anything by David Wishart that I didn't enjoy. I don't know what prompted me to go back to this particular one, but to beguile 90 minutes of a reading schedule, the Corvinus books are terrific. Once you are accustomed to that, once you'll see right away. When you read the first one, you'll see right away. And it's not the David Wishart. Lindsay Davis does the same thing in her books as well. You just have to agree to that okay, this character is going to wisecrack like someone from the 20th century. Now, if that bothers you, some readers of historical fiction just don't like that. They just don't want that conflicting tone. They want a little bit of old-style diction. If that's going to bother you, you'll know that right away, and you'll know whether or not that series is right for you. I would argue that if it does rub you the wrong way, maybe try to have it not rub you the wrong way anymore, because you'd be missing out on some really entertaining books. This next one, I just recently got. I read it. I was just so bottomlessly curious about it that I couldn't. I had to put it on the reading list for that night. And it is the old-fashioned diction of historical fiction. This is A.M. Mon, and this is Harry of Monmouth, a novel about King Henry V. that has the old thee and thou, thither and yon diction. In fact, I have the book here. Let me read you an example of what I'm talking about here. Let's see here. Where can I find you an example? Here's the king, the young king, being welcomed, giving a hero's welcome back into London. After his foray on the continent. The people awaited the king, so tight-packed they had scarce space to raise their arms. Sometimes at the street corners the tumblers would topple and spin for their amusement, but mostly these were keeping of their best until nightfall, when wine would have loosened the purse strings. Continually messengers rode down the route bringing news of the king's coming. He had met with the aldermen at Blackheath, and at the stone gate of the bridge the keys of London had been delivered into his hand. There he had had his first sight of the city, and though he seemed sick and weary, as if the strength which had upborne him through the rivers and marshlands and the swords of his enemies had gone, And he smiled, naming the city royal and praying that God should forever keep her from all hurt. That's that's one example. Let's see. Much earlier, when Henry is virtually a fugitive, Henry was now all but driven from Wales. He drew back to his own castle of Monmouth, his two Yorkist cousins, Albemarle and Cambridge, riding with him. Albemarle was Justiciar of Wales, but his allegiances went ever to the winning side. Henry knew it well, but he still had affection for the cousin who had shown him kindness in the coldness of Richard's court. Cambridge was yet handsome and cold of face. Between him and the princes there was much formal courtesy and small liking. Each always recalled the time on Tower Wharf when Cambridge had set Henry on his path like a puppy that had strayed there. Both the brothers took meat with the prince in his own chamber, Talbot with them. All were grim-faced, fearing Glendower's next advance. Henry told them of the guns. "I know not how they came by them," he said. "They have no means of casting them here in Wales." "Not unless friend Owen cast them up in a clap of thunder," Albemarle said. "No, cousin, I have knowledge of those guns. They were a gift to Glendower from the King of France." He spoke as between mouthfuls of food. Friend Owen was in Paris himself this spring. King Charles received him as he would any prince of the blood. They are bond brothers now, the truce with England thrown under the table and a treaty of friendship between them. So you see what I mean there? That kind of, it's this slightly antiquated diction that is what a lot of readers of historical fiction, certainly back then, 60 years ago, wanted, and even now, they mostly do want that. So if you do, I thought it was a strangely effective book in a way. It's ultimately boring. It's ultimately boring, but in that second passage that I read you see the thing that kept cropping up throughout this book that I really liked. That description of a character speaking as though between mouthfuls of food. That is genuinely inventive. That makes you stop and think, ooh, I know people who talk like that. I never would have put it that way. I've never read it put that way. And that happens throughout this book. This author, I don't know anything about this author, but this author will occasionally come up with an absolute gem of a piece of phrasing. Enough to keep me going. Even though, as you could tell from the first scene that I read you, this is mostly hero worship. Still, I don't think you're ever going to encounter it. I've never encountered it before. Then, I confess, Diamonds Are Forever was bothering me. So I went to other espionage and spy fiction. I would argue that most of the time James Bond is not acting as a spy. I don't actually know what he's acting as. I'm not a fan of the character at all. No, I'm not even talking about the books or the writing or the author, the insufferable author. I'm talking about just the character. And maybe I wanted an antidote to that. So I went to John Buchan. I went to the Richard Hannay novels of John Buchan. And I've read The 39 Steps a million times. I'm sure that all of you have too, or anybody who knows this author. If you know this author, you probably have read The 39 Steps. So I moved to Mr. Standfast, which is the third Hannay novel, and the one where he falls in love with, of course, a beautiful young girl. He falls in love with a beautiful young girl. I read Mr. Standfast. I found this vintage cover online, but I actually read it in this collection, which is Wordsworth, the Wordsworth edition. It somehow makes Hannay on the cover is, he's running from the biplane, that famous scene from 39 Steps, but he's a bell-bottom, boy band member. I don't know why that is. I don't know why it's not a full-grown adult on the cover there. But I've had this edition forever. For 10 years. I've had this edition for 10 years. And it has all of the Hannay stories in it. So I reread Mr. Standfast in this, and it's really, really good. It really is really good. I don't think Buchan is much remembered anymore, except for the 39 Steps, but he is really terrific. There'll be squeaker lines, really clunker lines from time to time. Like, for instance, famously, Mr. Standfast has a line. Richard Hannay has been called by his superiors. They have another clandestine mission for him. He is to go into the countryside where Buchan actually grew up. He describes the countryside so well, better than anybody. Henne's job is to ferret out local peacenik movements during World War One, and I guess provide all sorts of information to the government, maybe arrest some traitors. But in order to do that, he has to go undercover as one of them. So his superiors tell him this is going to be a real strain on your patriotism because you're going to have to hear horrible things about your country and also say them. But we need you to do this in order to find out, who's behind a German ring that's operating behind enemy lines here in England. And when Hannah is thinking about that early in the book, Buchan gives us that horrifying line that is now infamous. It's quoted in every article about Buchan, where Hannah is thinking this over and he's thinking, maybe I'm actually tempted to call my superiors and say, no, I won't do this. I can't do this. I can't blackmouth my own country when we're fighting for our life against the Germans on the front lines on the continent. And he finishes up that declaration by saying that it was a lot to ask of any white man. And in the 21st century, you feel like you've just been hit in the face with a brick. I don't think it was meant in an evil way at all, especially when you consider this author. This author wrote a novel called Prester John that is, it traffics in racist imagery and stereotypes, which is fundamentally a non-racist book, anti-racist. So I don't think that Buchan had that kind of evil in him. We often mention sorry about the lighting here. We often mention on BookTube what we call it, the offhand racism of the day, or the racism and sexism of the period. And we use that phrase as a way to avoid directly implicating the writer. I think you can tell when the writer is writing that stuff from white-hot conviction of their own, as opposed to when they're just repeating stuff that's out in the atmosphere. I would argue that writers today do the same thing. They might think they're ultra-conscious and hyper-woke about it, but I bet they do the same thing. How many books do in 21st century writing, how many books do characters just casually mention that the burger they had for lunch really perked them up? It's entirely possible that in, 2095, 2135, people will read that and say, oh my God, they were all monsters. They were still eating dead animals. That's entirely possible that could happen. I think that's more the nature of the trap that has sprung retroactively on Buchan. And that line does not cast a shadow on the book. The book was terrific. Especially, I wonder if I marked it. There's a scene where Hannah sees England for the first time. He's mostly familiar with South Africa. He sees England for the first time as something new that he now knows is precious enough for him to fight for. Okay. Before, my country had been South Africa, and when I thought of home, it had been the wide, sun-steeped spaces of the veldt or some scented glen of the Berg. But now I realized that I had a new home. I understood what a precious thing this England was, how old and kindly and comforting, how wholly worth striving for. The freedom of an acre of her soil was cheaply bought by the blood of the best of us. I knew what it meant to be a poet, though for the life of me I could not have made a line of verse. For in that hour I had a prospect as if from a hilltop which made all the present troubles of the road seem of no account. I saw not only victory after war, but a new and happier world after victory, when I should inherit something of this English peace and wrap myself in it till the end of my days. And Buchan wrote this while the war was still being waged, and no idea, of course, that World War II was coming, none whatsoever. But that kind of wonderful, those lyric intervals happen all throughout this thing. Really, when I finished with Mr. Standfast, I was really tempted to just keep reading Hannah stories, or even, God forbid, read the 39 Steps again. I don't think I will. There's no real call for that. I mean, there's plenty of other stuff to read. But I chose this vintage cover because someday I will find this little mass market paperback. That's a kind of neat cover, especially since it recalls the trenches and the air warfare of World War I, which are very present in this book. Before Hannah goes off into the countryside to play his little masquerade, he visits a friend who's severely shell-shocked. What they called shell-shock at the time, we would probably call it a combination of physical trauma and PTSD today. And it enrages him. His assignment to go and blackmouth, go and blacken the name of these servicemen enrages him when he thinks about the horrible price that some of his own men paid and are paying. And one of them pays the ultimate price in this book. I like this cover better than the Teen Dream cover, so I may look for it at the Brattle. And then we'll finish up, because of course this Friday read is going very, very long. And this is another old favorite. This is another thing that I'm pecking. I'm going at it over and over again. So it definitely counts as something that, as a book that I am reading, that I am currently reading. Ordinarily on Friday reads, I say that is the sticking point for me, because unlike the rest of you, I don't do anything but read. So I'm never working on a book. Usually. I'm never working on a book. Usually I read it, and then I'm done with reading it, and then I pick up something else to read. So I always complain, I whine, that my Friday reads really are 2 parts instead of 3. Most Friday reads are what I've read recently, what I'm currently reading, and what I'm going to read next. And I always whine that I can't do the middle one, because I'm never actually just reading a book. But that's not true. That's not true. Some things I am working my way through slowly. I am still, for instance, working my way through the big book of Cyberpunk. Slowly. And the same thing is true with this. I'm going to try to do this without shame on my face, because this was a horrible moment in the history of this channel. The new shocking translation of the Diaries of Franz Kafka. I think you could honestly say, actually I've got it right here. You could honestly say that I'm working my way through this. I'm going through it systematically, but not all at once. It's not a new book. The diary entries are not new to me. I read the old translation, for instance. It's a little bit of an embarrassing moment, because of course I made a big deal out of, I want to know what you do when you want a new book. What do ordinary people do when they want a new book? You tell me your best approaches and I'll take the best one. Because I thought this has been out too long, so I can't really request it from the publicist. And that resolve lasted just about as long as it took for me to see the prices of books. And I thought, oh no, that's right, books are ruinously expensive. And I know the publicist for this thing, so I just said, I know I'm a little late. I'll buy it if I'm too late. And she said, no, absolutely, I'll send you a copy. So, a little embarrassing, but I have been living in this thing on and off with other books. So that definitely counts as an am reading. I don't know about this light, though. We better wrap things up. That's a huge Friday reads anyway for now. There are all kinds of other things that I have read. A lot of those aggregator site indie books, I could have doubled the number of those in this. I pop those down like candy now. It's the only way I can justify adding so many to my Kindle is to read a lot of them. And it's giving me a much greater feel for what's out there in the indie world. I should talk more about those on this channel. I know that means a lot to the writers. I should also review them. I should put reviews up on Goodreads. Even if I don't do a full review on Open Letters, I should still put reviews up on Goodreads of all of these things. That's a lot to an author. I will once again try to mend my ways. But anyway, that is my weirdly lit Friday reads for today. I cannot seem to escape dodgy lighting on this channel lately. I simply cannot seem to do it. We have dodgy lighting now, and then rain developing tonight that I think is going to rain in buckets all day tomorrow. I don't think there's going to be any natural lighting tomorrow. But anyway, that's my Friday reads. Of course, with Friday reads, I want to know what you're doing. All 3 of those categories, what you've read recently, what you're working on, and what you're going to read next. Those of you who don't make BookTube videos, feel free to email me or leave comments here. And those of you who do make BookTube videos, if you don't make a Friday reads, maybe you should. Steve is curious. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.